keeping science separate from other ways of knowing is such a tragedy. It's such a mistake. Knowing is a group project. Changing the world is a group project. Our ability to understand the world is so tied to community. No individual can know everything. We are limited as individuals, but we can transcend those limits when we work together. We have to think about all of these aspirations in a collective way. And that really pushes against a lot of the narratives that we've been fed throughout our lives.
Welcome to Mind and Life. I'm Wendy Hasenkamp. My guest today is psychologist and cognitive scientist Molly Crockett. Molly is an associate professor of psychology at Princeton University and a leader in studying moral cognition and cultural evolution. As you'll hear, their work integrates an impressively wide range of perspectives, including psychology and neuroscience, but also economics, philosophy, and data science, to explore big questions about ethics, knowledge, and power in the digital age. And we get into a bunch of those questions on this show. I spoke with Molly back in September, and our conversation covered even more ground than I expected. We talk about their fascinating work to understand moral outrage on social media, as well as ethical issues around the use of AI and its implications for how we understand ourselves. There's lots more in here too, including Dalai Lama chatbots and the Burning Man Festival. But throughout, we keep coming back to the importance of narrative in shaping how we think about ourselves, others, and the world. And this is a topic I've been increasingly drawn to in recent years. I think it's actually one of the most important issues we're facing as a society and as a planet. What stories are we telling about the human mind, about our interconnection with each other and the world, and our capacity for change? Stepping back, one of the deep lessons I take from Molly's work is the importance of taking seriously multiple ways of knowing. This also draws links for me to our last episode with Jim Cohn and his work around social connection and the critical importance of community. As always, check the show notes for lots more on Molly's work, including her presentation to the Dalai Lama that she talks about in this episode. All right, settle in for this one. I think you're going to get a lot out of it. It's a real pleasure to share with you, Molly Crockett. Well, I'm super happy to be joined today by Molly Crockett. Molly, welcome to the show, and thanks so much for joining us.
My pleasure. It's a delight.
I often like to start with just a little bit of background on the guest and kind of understanding how they got into the work that they're doing. So I'm really curious for you. It seems like you started out in more traditional neuroscience and kind of decision making. So just wondering how you got interested in that. And then also it seems like your space has really broadened and evolved over time to include much bigger picture concepts like power structures and how we gain knowledge and all that. So I'm just wondering about the evolution of your own interests there.
Thank you for that question. I have always been interested in people and minds and social interactions. And as a highly ambitious young person, I gravitated towards what seemed to me like the most prestigious and powerful path available to me, which at the time was neuroscience. Probably if I were starting my PhD today with that mindset, it would be in AI, which we'll probably come back to at some point in this conversation.
Sure.
And I was incredibly fortunate to be able to train in social neuroscience at the very birth of the field with one of the leaders of the field. And I learned a ton, and it was really exciting. And at the same time, the longer I persisted within neuroscience and more broadly quantitative approaches to knowing humans, the more dissatisfied I felt with the limitations of those approaches. And as probably many of the listeners on this show will appreciate, there are just some ways of knowing our experiences, ourselves, and other people that can't be reduced to a number in a spreadsheet or a picture of a brain. And so as my career has progressed, I've found myself broadening out towards lots of different ways of knowing, coming from the humanities, coming from outside of academia, including my own practice as a meditation teacher and practitioner that has developed over 15 years. So I'm really just grateful and excited to be doing work in psychology and philosophy at this time. Being able to participate in multiple communities of knowledge that bring to the table so many different and diverse strengths of understanding that we're going to need to figure out like what it is that we are all doing with each other.
Yeah, it'll be so great to dig into the way that you weave in all these perspectives in the many different areas that you study. I thought maybe we could start with thinking about narrative. I've heard you talk a lot about the central importance of narrative and kind of the stories that we tell about ourselves and our world. So, could you share your perspective on dominant narratives that we have had, maybe historically or currently, and some of the ways that you think those might be wrong?
Sure. I mean, I've been thinking about narratives for many years now. And in recent years, I've been working with a brilliant postdoc, Judy Kim, who has a background in linguistics and cognitive science. And we've been exploring ways that we can think about what narratives are from a cognitive science perspective. And broadly, we're thinking about the ways in which narratives can transmit ideas that we have about the world. And one idea that is very prevalent, or a set of ideas, maybe is a better way to characterize it, is how we think about human nature. Do we think about it as something that's fixed, something that is sort of in our genes, something that is inherited over the course of evolution, or do we think of it as something more constructed, more fluid, something that we have control over? And then beyond that dichotomy, there's the question of like, what is human nature? Is it good? Is it evil? Fundamentally selfish, fundamentally altruistic? And because we are creatures that really make meaning out of interactions with other people and are highly sensitive to the beliefs of other people who we're interacting with, our own beliefs and our collective beliefs about human nature can become self-fulfilling prophecies. So one of my favorite papers by Dale Miller, published 20 some years ago, is called The Norm of Self-Interest. And it reviews collective beliefs that humans are fundamentally selfish. And of course, those beliefs are very helpful if you want to justify self-interested behavior, because there's this blurriness between what we call descriptive norms, how people are, and prescriptive norms, how we think people ought to be. And so if you tell a scientific story that like people are fundamentally selfish, it's in our genes, that then licenses selfish behaviors that didn't necessarily have to take place. So I'm really interested in how the stories we tell about human nature can create these kinds of self-fulfilling prophecies, and in particular, how different kinds of communities can mutually coordinate on narratives that are much more positive, that are much more optimistic and hopeful, that then, create the worlds that we want to live in.
I've heard you also talk about, in this context, like the beliefs we have about the ways that we change. So like you said, are these things inherent? Is it genetics? Kind of the whole nature-nurture debate. And then you've added in, or the way you think about it is adding in another layer kind of cultural evolution. Do I have that right? Or is that part of the nurture part?
Yeah, so when we talk about cultural evolution, broadly, we're talking about the ways in which knowledge builds on itself from generation to generation. And there's a lot of excitement and research around cultural evolution these days. One of my favorite scholars in this space is Cecilia Hayes, who's at Oxford. And she wrote a book called Cognitive Gadgets. It's about how one of the things that we transmit through culture is ways of thinking about the world. And so lately I've been thinking about how certain intuitive theories that we have about morality, about our values, about what other people are like, might be the material for cultural evolution. When one way of thinking is popular, if it gives you advantages, that way of thinking can get transmitted preferentially to the next generation and across a group or multiple groups within a generation. So one way of thinking about how these cognitive gadgets might be advantageous is if they're simple, right? So like we have limited cognitive resources and we gravitate towards ways of understanding the world that are useful fictions, right? That are simplifying ways of understanding our experiences and what's going on that aren't so inaccurate that we start to make mistakes. They're just accurate enough for us to be able to get by, but they do reduce and simplify and abstract certain aspects of our experience. And so the idea that there is such a thing as human nature and that there's like one singular quantity, like are people good, are people bad? That's an oversimplified way of thinking about what people are like, but it seems to have persisted for quite some time. It's really interesting to look at how different cultures and different religions treat ideas about human nature. So like in my meditation practice, I always like to come back to the image of like the gold statue buried in the mud, and that we have this sort of fundamental good nature that, you know, gets covered up with the stuff of life, but we can always come back to that with our practice by being mindful and so on.
I really appreciate you bringing in this kind of the way we tend to oversimplify our understanding of ourselves and the world. It's something that's come up on the show in different ways. And sometimes I think about it as a problem with the way we understand causality. And we're often thinking we're just putting something on a single cause because somehow that's easier for our systems to process. But of course, that's never the reality. Everything is so much more complex. So I'm wondering,
Totally.
yeah, do you have thoughts about, are there different kinds of stories we could tell or norms or like ways that we can maybe use cultural evolution to like help us be more interested or embracing of the complexity that we actually find ourselves in?
Yes. So you've hit on another sort of set of intuitive theories or ways of thinking about the world that have to do with how we explain cause and effect. And particularly when we're talking about people, we can explain behavior according to their disposition. That's called a dispositional attribution. So like that person was late because they're lazy, or that person didn't ship on time because they don't care about me. Or we can explain their behavior by making a situational attribution. We can say that person was late because they must have got stuck in traffic, or maybe like something happened with their family and there was chaos at the house in the morning. And like giving people the benefit of the doubt and understanding that behaviors have complex situational explanations. This is a distinction that has been around in social psychology for a really, really long time. I think it's particularly interesting to think about in the context of moral responsibility, and in particular Western ways that we tend to think about like good and bad behavior. I'm putting good and bad in scare quotes because I want to signal that I think it's a lot more complicated than that. But in my meditation practice, one of my teachers, Sarah Shah, told us about another way of thinking about cause and effect that comes from the Abhidhamma, one of the old texts in the Buddhist canon. And there are ways of thinking about causality in Eastern religions that are just way more complicated than how we typically think about it in Western culture. And so I'm really interested in ways in which we could explore different kinds of storytelling that highlight the much more complicated nature of causality. And here, my friend and one of my favorite writers, Rebecca Solnit, is a master of this. And she's doing a lot of work in climate. And she has highlighted in many of her writings how harmful it is to portray any sort of activism as being the responsibility of a lone hero, typically male, typically someone who employs violence to get what they want to get done. And as she highlights through her work with activist communities, like activism is a group effort. It is collective. There's no like one cause of any single outcome. It's jointly caused, it's collectively brought about. And I think those kinds of stories are so important because if we only hear the hero stories and we think, well, I'm not going to be a hero, then that licenses us to not do anything.
Right. Yeah, I really appreciate you bringing this lens of kind of the way that the stories that we tell justify different behaviors. I think that's such an important thing to keep in mind that I feel like is often not raised. So thank you for bringing that nuance. Well, I know you've been working a lot in the digital space lately as this becomes a bigger and bigger part of all of our lives. And I'd love to hear you describe some of your work around the experience of moral outrage and how the digital platforms that, you know, we're all immersed in can kind of co-opt the ways that we naturally have social learning as humans and how that plays out in digital spaces.
Sure. So I started thinking about social media and outrage in 2016. I was actually living in the UK at the time, and so I witnessed and lived through Brexit and then the election of Trump, within a few months of each other. And, I had been studying moral outrage and punishment for a long time outside of the context of digital media, just looking at like what kinds of situations trigger outrage, what motivates people to punish wrongdoing, unfairness, and so on. What are the brain systems that are involved? And that work showed that, punishment, which will come as no surprise to anyone who has participated in it, it's very rewarding, right? It's energizing. It can be fun to, especially with other people, like collectively shame and punish someone who has violated something that we think is really important. Where I started to get worried was I just noticed that I was spending a lot of time on social media, like posting about Brexit, about Trump, like an unhealthy amount of time. Spending time in a way that was not mindful, that I was losing track of time. I would like sort of open up my app, Facebook in the morning, intending to just sort of briefly check it before sitting down to work. And then like hours would disappear. And I was just like noticing this happening. And I got really curious about what was going on. And I applied my training in neuroscience, which was around, how do habits form? How do reinforcements shape the way that we behave? And in particular, like compulsive behavior, addictive kinds of behaviors.
Right.
And so I thought, oh, this is a variable reinforcement reward schedule where I'm getting like random amounts of likes, unpredictable amounts of likes for things that I post. And we know from decades of research on reward learning that's like the best way to create a habit is to give people random rewards for a response. And so I started developing this idea that maybe the structure of rewards on social media would in particular reinforce expressions of outrage. And, rewards can reinforce any sort of behavior, but outrage is really special because not only is it a really sort of high intensity, high arousal emotion, but it also has really important social signaling properties, right? So like there's this beautiful work by Jill Jordan, who's at Harvard Business School, showing that when you express outrage or punish people from wrongdoing, other people trust you more because they think, oh, if that person's punishing that thing, they're the kind of person who would not do that thing. And so that it has this reputation enhancing property. And of course, when we're on social media, it's all about reputation. It's all about, building an audience, gaining a following. And the algorithms that decide what to show us on social media are selecting content that they expect will be engaging. And so outrage is this like really attractive kind of content for those algorithms that of course make more money the more time that we all stay online. So you put all those pieces together and you see that the information ecosystem that these tech companies build really has this effect of keeping us all glued to the screens and doing it by making us all outraged and share our outrage together. So I developed the theory, and then I was very, very fortunate to recruit a super, super talented postdoc to my lab, Billy Brady, who's now a professor at the Kellogg School of Business at Northwestern, and also a research technician, Killian McLaughlin, who's currently a PhD student with me at Princeton. And they're like data science whizzes, and we developed these tools to firstly be able to measure expressions of moral outrage using machine learning. So being able to label millions of tweets with the probability that they contain outrage or not, and then use that tool to test broad hypotheses about how people are rewarded for expressing outrage, and importantly, how people learn socially to express outrage. So one of the main set of findings that came out of our first paper published in 2021 was that over time, people come to express more outrage through two mechanisms. One, through conformity or through norm learning. So when you are in a social network where lots of other people are expressing outrage, you express more outrage too to match your tone to the norms of the group. But also, on an individual basis, you get rewarded for expressing outrage. And the more you get rewarded for expressing outrage today, the more likely you are to post outrage tomorrow. So we can see evidence for reinforcement learning in the expression of outrage over time. And this has all sorts of knock-on effects. We're currently studying the effects of outrage on the spread of misinformation. We're interested in particular about distorted beliefs that can arise when you have these norms for expressing outrage and a medium that really decouples the expression of outrage from our direct experience, right? So we did these studies where we looked for people who had recently expressed outrage in a tweet. Then we sent them a direct message and we're like, hey, we noticed you just tweeted this. On a scale of 1 to 7, how outraged were you when you sent this? So we get those responses from the people who wrote the tweets. Then we show those tweets to another group of people who are Twitter users but didn't write the tweets. And we say, hey, how outraged on a scale of 1 to 7 was this person, do you think, when they wrote the tweet? And then we compare those numbers, and what we find is consistently people who are reading the tweets overestimate the amount of outrage that the people who wrote the tweets said they experienced at the time.
Yeah.
And this has knock-on effects. When you're reading tweets that are getting overperceived, you think that the outgroup, people who have different political beliefs from you are more hostile. You're more likely to post outragey tweets yourself. And so you get this sort of amplification polarization effect that comes from overperceiving outrage expressions from tweets. And this effect is particularly pronounced in individuals who spend the most time on social media reading about politics. So if you're immersing yourself in an outragey environment, you develop a rational belief that there's a lot of outrage around.
Yeah.
And so then when you get a new signal that's maybe a little ambiguous, you are using a rational belief updating process to infer, oh, that's probably outrage because most of what I see is outrage. Do you see what I mean? So we're basically creating these systems that highly incentivize the expression of outrage, inflate beliefs about other people's outrage, and we shouldn't be then surprised that everyone feels outraged, but we should also question whether that reflects a ground truth or whether that is a delusion that we need to work towards getting ourselves out of.
Yeah, that's so, that helps me understand like the feed forward system of how outrage breeds more outrage, and especially in a polarized environment or even an environment where there's just small disagreements, they can quickly become like hugely separated positions and everyone's just angry, which really describes a lot of the social media environment. So that's really important to keep that awareness that some of it is manufactured, or at least, as you say, it's a delusion. It's not an accurate reflection of how people really feel. And thinking back again with your lens of kind of power structures and justification, and I was thinking about this work and thinking, well, who benefits from this situation? And clearly, as you said, the platforms and the people making money from people engaging with the platforms are direct beneficiaries. But do you think there's other larger frames of like people in politics? I've heard this idea that it behooves them to have an outraged public. What's your lens on kind of bigger picture of who's benefiting from this structure that's been created?
That's a great question. So yeah, I absolutely agree that tech companies benefit. I also think that anyone who wants control, who is already in a position of power, who is seeking power, who wants to control the populace, benefits, because anger and outrage, these are dehumanizing emotions, right? Like they're emotions that motivate finding who did it so we can punish them. And when you have a community who's hyper fixated on who did it, who's the bad guy that we can punish, that is possible to manipulate. Again, this is not novel.
Right.
This has been happening for a long time. It's the oldest play in the book to exploit social inequality and anger over not having enough for your family, finding a scapegoat to blame and fanning the flames around that.
Again, back to the single cause as well.
Yes, exactly, in the single cause. One thing I'll just add on that, though, right, is that if we consider narratives to give us ways of thinking about the world that are just structures divorced from the actual content, right? The more stories we tell that has a single villain, a single victim, and a single hero, the more prepared we are for harmful narrative. So the structure carries through even as the content might change.
That's so interesting. It's also making me think of, I was just reading your website about the different areas of interest of your lab, which part of what you were talking about is the role of scientists in creating narratives for society. And that's something I'm really interested in. And it's been increasingly clear to me how much, science has become kind of a new religion in many respects. And so what scientists say has such a power to shape the way that we're thinking. So I'm just wondering about that too. You were just talking about the structure of narratives, and just wondering your thoughts there about the role that scientists could play in creating different narratives.
Absolutely. I think it's a huge responsibility that is underappreciated by scientists.
Yeah.
At least I could speak for myself. I did not fully appreciate how much the way that I, as a scientist, talk about the human mind can, potentially impact the way that everyone thinks about what minds are, what their potentials are. So, to go back to the example of human nature, when scientists write books about the science of human nature, that not only has potential to persuade the public about that particular scientist's particular view of human nature, but also reinforces the idea that there is such thing as a singular human nature in the first place. And of course, also aligns differences between different humans and different cultures. We have a bad habit in cognitive science of talking about humans in general, when in reality, the vast majority of our studies are performed on white educated people in rich countries, what the anthropologist Joe Henrich calls weird, Western educated, industrialized, rich, democratic countries. And, there's been a lot of acknowledgement and attention to this problem in cognitive science. I won't say that we as a field are not aware of this. We absolutely are, and we talk about it a lot. But there's a big gap between talking about it and doing something about it. And we continue to publish papers describing human behavior when our samples are much narrower. And, I do this too. It is a norm in the field, and I complain about it. I am also super guilty about it. And it's ultimately a collective action problem, because journals, especially high impact journals, have expectations around how papers are written. Students who are early in their careers and want to progress in their careers need to publish in those journals. So there's a huge cost to any individual scientist to writing their whole paper about Princeton undergraduates as opposed to human cognition. But it's a big problem. I think what I worry about is the misperceptions that kind of language can cause amongst the broader public. And how should we be thinking about that as a problem? Another manifestation of the responsibility that I think cognitive scientists have in how they talk about the mind has to do with this era of AI that we are now entering into. And in particular, there are a lot of discussions around whether AI products are human-like, right?
Right.
So you will see, there have been dozens and dozens, hundreds at this point of publications sort of testing GPT or other large language models on various psychological tasks. And when a high correlation between the performance of the model and human performance is observed, there's a temptation to describe the performance of the model as human-like. But there are risks with using that kind of language, because the set of things that humans can do is way, 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 way bigger than the set of things that these models can do, no matter how impressive their performance is, which in many cases is impressive. But when you then describe them as human-like, you're narrowing what we take humans to be. And that could have bad consequences down the line. There's some really nice work being done by the philosopher Shannon Valor, who just published a book called The AI Mirror around this question, and also Sherry Turkle, who is a psychologist and anthropologist at MIT, who has long been a voice for thinking about how technologies change our relationships to one another. So I think it's important to keep exploring this space and to keep talking about, like, how should we talk about technology? How should we talk about the science of the mind? And can we talk about it in ways that are aware of how the language we use can collectively shape our notions of who we are and what we can be?
Yeah, this is a really interesting space, and I'm glad you brought up the AI part. I wanted to get into where you think the landscape is about AIs being used to kind of be human-like, better than humans, particularly in the area of compassion or empathy in the ways that bots could, quote unquote, pay attention to us, give us support. So what's your sense of that landscape now, and how can we be thinking about that?
Yeah, so I'm working on several papers about this set of questions right now. And the main questions I'm asking myself are, what do we mean when we say an AI product can empathize? Are we relying on a definition of empathy that stacks the deck in the favor of the machine? There are a lot of arguments that, for example, therapists or friends or romantic partners or any sort of person who we might seek support from is not available 24 hours a day, but the AI is available 24 hours a day. And that's just a really interesting observation. Turkle has written about how creating expectations that social support will be available 24 hours a day could have harmful spillover effects into our human relationships, which even I think the most enthusiastic advocates for AI would not want to do away with entirely, right?
Yeah, right.
So we need to be thinking about how outsourcing various human skills and activities to a machine, even if the machine works really, really well, might then feed back onto our own relationships with one another. And this is a conversation that I think a lot of people are having. I'm in particular interested in thinking about how the evidence that's offered for human-like performance on these various tasks might reveal just as much about the limitations of the science as it does about the capabilities of the machines. And this is a project that I'm working on with Lisa Masseri, who's an anthropologist of science and technology at Yale. And she and I have just published a paper about how artificial intelligence can create illusions of understanding in scientific research, where we think we understand the world more, but we're actually understanding it less. And that's a big risk, I think, anytime you're going to engage in wishful thinking about what it's possible to achieve with these machines and the fantasies of superhuman performance that seem to be really garnering a lot of attention these days.
Yeah. You joined us this past summer at our Summer Research Institute. It was so wonderful to have you there. And you shared a great story about virtual Dalai Lama bots, which I didn't even know existed. Could you share your experience with that?
Absolutely. So when ChatGPT was released in 2022, there was a huge rush to create applications using that technology. And a lot of those applications took the form of chatbots that adopted particular personas. So if you go to the GPT store and you search for your favorite celebrity, there's a good chance that there will be at least some instances of chatbots trained on the publicly available text from that celebrity and designed to mimic responses from that celebrity.
Okay, right. That makes sense because there's so much text from people who are famous that they can create better bots. Okay, yeah.
Exactly. And large language models are very, very good at mimicking particular styles of speech. And you don't even have to give them that much text to prompt it to mimic that style. So I was curious and I searched for the Dalai Lama on the ChatGPT store, and the search turned up at least a dozen different versions of Dalai Lama chatbots. Some of them were just the Dalai Lama. Some of them were like a hybrid of like the Dalai Lama and Jesus and
Oh,
like
wow.
other religious. Yeah, there's a wide variety available. And I was curious, so I engaged with it a bit, and I asked the bot various questions about questions at the intersection of my research and the Dharma. And the responses were incredibly reasonable. Like the chatbot talks about compassion, it's very coherent. It totally gives a response that if you have read any of His Holiness's work, like, or watched videos, like, it's like, oh, wow, okay. But of course, you ideally want to be able to compare that response against the real in the flesh experience. And I am incredibly fortunate to have had the, life-changing and very unique experience of meeting His Holiness in person a couple of years ago at the Mind and Life dialogues with His Holiness. And so I asked the chatbot the exact same question that I had asked His Holiness in person about the role of outrage in social justice movements, because, I really come back to this again and again in my research. Outrage can be a really powerful motivating force, right? And I
Right.
think especially for communities with a history of marginalization and being targeted by injustice, people of color, women, disabled people, queer people, outrage can be necessary and it can be morally appropriate in some circumstances. But then the question is like, what do you do with it? How do you engage it in a way that's sustainable? And, I don't think we have all the answers to that question. I have found a lot of wisdom in Buddhist teachings around that question. So when I asked the chatbot, it basically said something like, you really need to have compassion. Anger alone is not like enough to confront injustice. You need compassion, both for the people who are suffering and for the people who are perpetrating the suffering. Totally reasonable. So then I go back to the video of our exchange with His Holiness from a couple of years ago. And I was like, okay, like I'm going to find out that what he said was like way more insightful and wise.
Yeah.
And so I watched the video, and watching the video was just like totally discordant with my memory of the interaction.
Oh, interesting.
My memory of the interaction was like everyone in the room got more quiet. And it was like there was a spotlight with him and me and our interaction, and our minds were like coming together in this space. And I asked a question, and he's listening through his translator, Thupten Jinpa, and he responds to my question with, as I recollect it, something to do with bringing in a metaphor of, if you're a teacher and you are trying to teach a student and the student is misbehaving, you shouldn't get angry with them. You should approach them with compassion and sort of approach the mistake from a place of love. And, the words just totally don't do it justice.
Right.
You really had to be there. And when I was there, when I was receiving that teaching from him, it reverberated through my whole body. I felt some knowledge like shifting in my very bones. And I understood how outrage and compassion and wisdom and social justice can play together in a way that I still struggle to put into words. And when I went back and watched the video, it's like the words cannot recapture that feeling of understanding that arose between the two of us.
Right.
And I think that that's really important. I think that it shows how words alone are not enough to transmit a teaching. They can be a cue, they can be a guide, absolutely. But like there is something that is irreplaceable about humans being physically together and transmitting understanding through our bodies, through our embodied presences. And that's just something that, because chatbots don't have bodies, or even if they're put into a robot body, like they don't have a human body that's mortal and vulnerable and, constantly shifting. Like, I just don't think that they can do that kind of teaching. And so I really worry about what gets lost when you replace human
Yeah.
teachers with chatbots, which is something that is literally happening right now. In the UK, there is a high school classroom where the teachers have been replaced by an AI program. It's being really hyped because it's like individually tailored by this indefatigable, always available teacher for every student. And, there's a lot of excitement and rhetoric about like what potentialities AI products can offer for education. And I can see the appeal, right? I can see the
Mm-hmm.
appeal of offering a technical solution to a widespread, really gnarly problem, which is that we don't invest enough in education. But like, rather than trying to solve the hard problem, which maybe even isn't even that hard, just like pay teachers more, and then there will be more teachers.
Right.
Um, I'm being glib, but seriously, like there are ways that we can approach educational inequality in our country and around the world that don't rely on outsourcing human labor to machines. And there are just a lot of really important lessons from the past. I've been reading this book called The Charisma Machine by Morgan Ames. The subtitle is The Life, Death, and Legacy of One Laptop per Child. And this was an educational program with a vision of delivering laptops to every child in the world. And the hope and the vision was that by delivering this technology, the children would teach themselves how to program and lift themselves out of poverty. And spoiler alert, it didn't succeed because it turns out that to support education, you really need community investment. You need a ton of infrastructure around to support learning and education. And what the creators of the One Laptop per Child project failed to appreciate was that they had all taught themselves to program as kids and thought it would be easy for other kids to do that too, but largely neglected to see how much social support they had around them, how much infrastructure they had around them. And this is something that we see happening over and over again. People who are fortunate to be born into positions of power and privilege cannot see how much that played in getting them to their levels of success today. And so, we're seeing the same narratives emerge with AI in education that is so beautifully documented in the Charisma Machine. And I don't understand why we keep having this conversation. I guess I do understand it. It's money. Like that's,
Yeah.
reason for much of this stuff.
Yeah, yeah. This is so interesting, the juxtaposition you're raising of just the importance of embodiment in human interaction and really the centrality of that, or what is lost when you take that out. Because obviously something is still transmitted, but something is definitely lost. I'm wondering if there's any research on that, like in the digital space or...
Yes, there absolutely is. Some of my favorite work on this comes from Juliana Schroeder at Berkeley, and she has looked at how empathy and understanding get degraded when you move from an in-person interaction to a voice interaction to a video interaction to a text interaction.
Right.
And, as you might expect, like the fewer channels of communication that are available, the more information gets lost along the way.
Maybe somewhere we can go from there, speaking of embodiment in person. I know you've also done some work on transformative experiences, particularly in mass gatherings. Can you share a little bit about that? I know you've done some work at Burning Man, which is maybe you could even describe the festival in case some listeners aren't familiar.
Sure. Yeah. So this work is inspired by originally and now in collaboration with the philosopher Laurie Paul, who's now at Yale. And Laurie wrote a book in 2014 called Transformative Experience, which is just a wonderful book, but one of the contributions is that it maps out what it is to have a transformative experience in terms of its epistemology. So a transformative experience is an experience that involves two sorts of transformation. One is what Laurie calls epistemic transformation, and that is when you learn something new that you couldn't have learned without having the experience. So lots of experiences are like this, but some are more like this than others, right? Like there's a way in which you just can't imagine what it is like before you have the experience. So really big life-changing experiences like having a kid or moving to another country with a very different culture from your own, experiencing a trauma. Like these are things that we just can't imagine before we have the experience. Also more mundane stuff like she gives the example of tasting a durian fruit for the first time. Like it's like super weird and you can't really explain what it's like to someone who hasn't had it. So when you taste a durian fruit for the first time, you undergo an epistemic transformation. You have new knowledge. You now know what it's like. You didn't know what it was like before. So that's the first component of a transformative experience. The second component is what she calls personal transformation. And that is involving a transformation to, your values, your preferences, the very structure of like how you find value in the world, what you prioritize. And so profound life experiences have this quality. People describe when they have a kid that like everything changes, things that they thought were not important before now seem really important and vice versa. Not all experiences that are epistemically transformative are also personally transformative. So like most people would probably not like radically change their preferences when they taste durian for the first time. Although maybe some people might, but the experiences that have this sort of personally transformative quality are also often epistemically transformative. So I met Laurie in 2014, right after I had just gone to Burning Man for the first time. Burning Man is a intentional community of about 80,000 people set up temporarily in the desert of Nevada once a year in August. There are massive art structures everywhere, and it's a gift economy. So no money is exchanged pretty much when you're there. There's gifting. It was set up in the 80s, I think. Just been many years now to sort of offer an alternative to the real world, the default world as we call it. And I listened to Laurie give her talk about transformative experience, and I went up to her after. I was like, "Hey, I just had one of those." And it turned out she was involved in a grant that was giving out small grants to teams wanting to study empirically transformative experience. And so I built a team to set up temporary labs at Burning Man and at other secular mass gatherings around the US and the UK to sort of try to capture what it was like to have the experience of immersing oneself in a culture that was totally different from one's own, and not just different in a sort of like I'm experiencing a foreign country kind of sense, but different in terms of values and different in terms of social norms. Aside from the gift economy and the sort of centering of generosity and care at Burning Man, it's also a very anti-normative space, especially in terms of like how you dress, how you present yourself to other people. And so I think for me personally, it was the first time I had ever experienced a social world where I didn't feel like I was being judged on my appearance. And I didn't feel like I had to perform any particular way of being. And that was both epistemically and personally transformative for me. What we found in our research was that the longer people spend, the more time people are immersed in this environment, the more expansive their feelings of generosity towards other human beings become. And these are effects that last for about 6 months after attending the event.
Yeah, that's so interesting. And I remember that you'd made a nice control that's over and above the effect of substances that might have been consumed at this event, right?
Yes.
So that's an important nuance. But I'm thinking about just the power of being in a space where, as you say, the norms are different and agreed upon and kind of really central. Like even I feel like on a meditation retreat, this happens. It's a very structured environment, very unusual. structured environment where, yeah, you take, precepts, you kind of make agreements when you come in, and there's just this sense that everyone is there for the benefit of everybody and kind of having the same intentions. And it's amazing the kinds of transformation that can happen, probably over and above the actual sitting meditation practice or whatever you might be doing there, but just from being in that context.
Absolutely.
I feel like I'm a different person when I'm in those settings, and so much more generous, so much more attentive to the needs of other people. And so that's just fascinating.
Totally. And it goes back to this idea about human nature as something that we can create for ourselves, right? Like we can create conditions that bring out different elements of how we can be towards one another. And that's really at odds with a picture where it's like, well, back in the Stone Age, when we evolved, we like have these Paleolithic emotions that we now just like can't have any control over. And it's really bad that modern environments clash with these Paleolithic emotions. I think that's just a wrong way of thinking about all of our potential. And it's also a very pessimistic way of thinking about our potential. Quite a lot of the discourse around technology and society takes this very sort of fixed view of human nature. So you have, E.O. Wilson, who I was alluding to just now. The full quote is something like, we have Paleolithic emotions, medieval institutions, and godlike technologies, and it's very dangerous. And you have folks like Tristan Harris, who has been very concerned about the sort of harmful effects of technology on well-being and social interactions, who also sort of takes a view that's very motivated by evolutionary psychology. And it's like, well, there's a human nature, and the human nature is being exploited by tech companies. And because human nature is something fixed that we can't change, we have to design technologies around our nature so they will play more nicely together. But I don't know if the data supports that view. I think there are alternative explanations that just haven't been explored, because like we've also just set up our environments to bring out certain elements of our possibilities, and we could do otherwise.
Yeah, this is also making me think in psychology, for so long there was this idea, back to William James and probably even before that, that kind of personality is fixed after adolescence, right? And your brain develops, and then there it is. And, you're kind of stuck with whoever you are. And that view, coming back to this idea of narrative and stories, like shaped so much of the research that was done or wasn't done, right? Like
Totally.
Personality traits and all sorts of things that were measured about humans over the years and decades. Nobody ever tried to shift them because it was assumed they were fixed traits. And now we're seeing so many things.
Absolutely. And because there's this view that we don't change after age 25, there's almost no research on identity change in adulthood, even though the existence of transformative experiences suggests that there are profound changes that we can undergo as adults, or indeed at any point in our lives. I actually have a grant from the McDonald Foundation with a really smart postdoc, Sally Shea, who's about to start as a professor at Simon Fraser. And together with the rest of our team, we're studying identity change as people become parents for the first time, and sort of studying longitudinally how people see themselves over time before and after their child arrives. And we see this as filling a big gap in the literature that does assume that like, oh, no, like once you're an adult, you're not changing anymore. And like, gosh, I've changed so many times, like profoundly as an adult. Like it just can't be true.
Yeah. And even the same, has existed in neuroscience, right? Like it was only a couple decades ago that we realized that brains, in fact, continue to change throughout our lives. So it's just so interesting, the cycle between a narrative and then what we even explore, and then how the results of that or lack of results of that then continue to shape the narrative or reinforce it.
Totally.
I'm wondering, your experience as a meditator, has that merged at all with your scientific research or come into the lab in any way?
Yeah, so they were separate, like very separate for a very long time, partially because I think in science there's this kind of stigma against anything like woo-woo. Like if you're doing anything spiritual, like best to keep that behind closed doors because like that's not scientific and that's, going to pollute your science, your objectivity,
Right.
or whatever. I think that at an unconscious level, of course, my interest in meditation and in Buddhism came from a similar place to my interest in the kinds of humanistic and ultimately like spiritually engaged questions that are central in my research. But I kept them very separate until Mind and Life invited me to meet the Dalai Lama. And I was like, oh, that's the thing. Like, I can talk about my research in this context. And I mean, it was just a beautiful experience. One of the most sort of life-altering, career-shifting experiences that I'll forever be grateful for. Because, the process of preparing that talk, which, was explicit that it was meant to be a talk about my research. But of course, who is going to be in the audience is, Buddhist practitioners of many different stripes. And Roshi Joan Halifax, who was the chair of my session and who I got to know really well throughout that process and remains a dear friend and mentor, really pushed me to think about how to make those ideas connect with broader questions in Mind and Life, in Dharma. And then I was also really fortunate to be able to get feedback on my talk from meditation teachers and friends in my Sangha. And it was just magical presenting the work in that setting because it made it so clear to me how keeping science separate from other ways of knowing is such a tragedy. It's such a mistake. We have this like artificial hierarchy around, oh, well, within the academy, like, well, math is the best, and then physics, and then, chemistry, but, neuroscience is better than psychology. It's, more rigorous or whatever. And like, and then of course, all of science is, better than the humanities, supposedly. And then, academia is supposed to be a superior way of knowing the world than like alternative, indigenous forms of knowledge or, knowledge that comes from just life experience and practice in various ways. And like, that's just such a shame that we think about knowledge in that way because it's epistemic injustice, right? So this is a framework that comes from philosophy, and I find it really helpful to think through these kinds of questions. Epistemic injustice is a way of thinking about how people are harmed as knowers. And it takes the form of credibility excess and credibility deficit. So credibility excess is when somebody gets believed more than they deserve because of, say, like their social identity is one that is prestigious or that they're coming from a field that historically has been more respected. And this is, of course, like credibility that is totally disconnected from the content of whatever that person is saying, right? So like, in epistemology, like whether something is believed, like, you should consider the content. And credibility excess is when, controlling for content, you just get more credit if you're a man or if you're a white person or if you're a physicist. And the flip side is credibility deficit, where even if you're saying the same thing, you get taken less seriously if you're a woman than a man, or if you're Black than you're white, or if you are working outside the academy versus working within. And, we should be upset about those injustices because they detract from our understanding of the world. And our ability to understand the world is so tied to community. No individual thinker can understand everything. No individual can know everything. We are limited as individuals, but we can transcend those limits when we work together. And people are really good at this. From a very, very young age, kids can track who knows what. So like, that's the person to go to if you need help with food. That's the person to go to if you like need help with school or whatever. We're really, really good at keeping track of who knows what in our communities. And that's how we're able to transcend the limits of our own minds. Now, people who stand to make a lot of money from AI want to replace that gorgeous, organic, communal act of knowing with like the machine who supposedly can know everything. But like that totally fails to recognize all of the diverse ways in which we know stuff through our bodies, through the history of our own experiences, through our relationships with one another. And so when I look at a future that many people are excited about and machines are replacing human knowers for lots of stuff, I just get really depressed because I feel like even though folks who are excited about technology like to paint themselves as optimists and the rest of us who are asking questions as pessimists, I think it's the other way around. I think people who are raising questions about replacing humans with machines are the real optimists about what humans can do. And what we're worried about is foreclosing on the possibilities of human potential when you just try to take the easy technological fix and try to do it with the superhuman machine.
Yeah. Well, Molly, this has been so great to chat. This has been really illuminating. I'm wondering, are there any kind of big picture take homes that you'd like to share as we're wrapping up? I'm thinking back to your lens on narrative and stories. And what are some other stories? I think you've been sharing them the whole conversation, but maybe stories that we can be thinking about shifting towards in the moment that we face in the world.
Sure. I mean, I think, one story that is a zombie story that really doesn't want to die is the idea of the lone genius who will save everyone, who knows everything and who will save everyone. And like, knowing is a group project. Changing the world is a group project. We have to think about all of these aspirations in a collective way. And that really pushes against a lot of the narratives that we've been fed throughout our lives. But it's up to all of us ultimately to change how we think about who we are and what we can do together.
Oh, wonderful. Thank you so much, Molly. This is great. Thank you for all of your work in these spaces. I think it's so important to be broadening and integrating the way that you do across so many disciplines and viewpoints. So thanks for taking the time today.
My pleasure. Thank you so much. Great questions.
This episode was edited and produced by me and Phil Walker, and music on the show is from Blue Dot Sessions and Universal. Show notes and resources for this and other episodes can be found at podcast.mindandlife.org. If you enjoyed this episode, please rate and review us on Apple Podcasts and share it with a friend. And if something in this conversation sparked insight for you, let us know. You can send an email or voice memo to podcast@mindandlife.org. Mind and Life is a production of the Mind and Life Institute. Visit us at mindandlife.org, where you can learn more about how we bridge science and contemplative wisdom to foster insight and inspire action towards flourishing. If you value these conversations, please consider supporting the show. You can make a donation at mindandlife.org under support. Any amount is so appreciated, and it really helps us create this show. Thank you for listening.